So I don't have a clapboard, so we can't really sync up our.
That was a social isolation DIY clapboard.
Yeah. One of, I think, the most provocative parts of this exhibition, and one of the most interesting to me, was the title you chose for the exhibition. Can you talk about why you chose to title the exhibition Mother?
Yes. Um, so when I started making the work for the show, I was thinking a lot about the body, and I knew I wanted to foreground um, body imagery in the work. And I started making the photographs that featured body fragments in them. And when you asked me to come up with a title, I had already made a number of images, and I was sitting in the studio looking at all of these images and thinking, what am I going to title this show? And I didn't want to have the body in the title. Somehow it felt limiting to me to somehow have the title just like reiterate what the imagery was. And I was thinking a lot about what I imagine the viewer experience might be, being in the gallery, surrounded with images of body fragments, hands, feet, eyes, torso. And I started thinking that the viewer might feel that they were inside of a body. And from there, I made a leap to like when you're inside your mother. And I just, in a flash, decided Mother would be a really weird title for this show. And by weird, I mean great.
Yeah, I mean, now that we've had the show up for a couple months and I've given many tours of it,
Mm-hmm.
and shared it with my students, I know the title definitely, I would say it's almost unnerving to some people who
Mm-hmm.
come through.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's a little unnerving to me. It feels really potent, and it makes it inescapable to see the work from this really kind of loaded psychological perspective. And yet the work is, my work always, I think, has a lot of enigmatic qualities. So it becomes this like really fertile ground for, I guess, psychological association and the word you and I both have used is something like triggering. So it like it gave a lens and also a particular kind of potency to the imagery.
so tell me about how you decided to depict the body this way, and what you're trying to convey with this aesthetic.
So my approach to the body, I think, has always been through the abject, and also through a kind of comic grotesque vocabulary. And, I mean, super important to me have always been Guston's, not even bodies, but feet and eyeballs. I mean, speaking of body fragments, but that kind of incredibly pathos-inducing, comic, and completely abject body. So that's just, so that's always my way into the body.
I'm thinking about an image like, in particular, the Punchline diptych. With that one, with its title and with its image as well, maybe that one would be a good one to sort of talk about your interest in kind of a grotesque deadpan humor. Is that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe that image. I mean, I think something that goes with that should be said is that there's also a performance aspect to it. And in this image in particular, it's my arms in a kind of awkward position holding up a plaster sculpture of a foot that I made, and I'm behind right? I'm behind the screen, as it were. I mean, I have glass scene and a window, which is creating a screen, right? So we're looking at a silhouette. And I think that part of the comic, grotesque, or abject play has to do also with the performance that I'm doing to make the image. And, you know, I mean, I have an irrepressible impulse to always make a joke. One of the things that I really like about this image in particular is that on the edges of the image is an almost like classical lighting. You know, the image at the edge, there are black curtains held together with white cord. And there's like, I feel like there's a seriousness to the edges of this image that is, you know, in high contrast to the goofiness of the body in the center. And which I like, you know, tempering one with the other. And the body here too, this is, you know, it's really like, it's really the fragmented body, because something about this diptych is you kind of see where the body should be between those two images, but it's absent. It just kind of falls apart.
The sort of, there's kind of a triptych of still lives that are really, in some ways I'm thinking of them more as classical photography still lives, in that you're really arranging and lighting objects in space in the studio. There is a form introduced here that we see later in a major way in the back room in the gallery, the kind of pillow tube form.
Noodle intestine.
The noodle intestine. Tell me about, you know, the thinking behind these three, what I've been calling the sort of still lives within the show.
So I mean, that's what I was talking about with Punchline. You know, I think the edges of those images, like these, reference like a really, you know, classic kind of photographic studio setup with like the gorgeous daylight and etc. I think of these, I guess you could think of them as still lives. I mean, these are so stagey. I think of these as really as performance spaces or as stage sets. And they all, actually not all three of them, but Elephant and More Fragile were both made in the studio that I work in Montana, which literally has a stage. I'm really thinking of these as really as theatrical spaces, which is kind of why they need to go together, and why in the installation we put them in a little bit in their own space, because I feel like these function a little bit differently than a lot of the other images. The camera's back just a little bit more, so you're seeing this. You see your sense of scale is a little bit different. You have a couple of more anchors in terms of like a ground plane in two of them. I feel like these are very different spaces from a lot of the others. I want to put the living human body in the image, and I want to put it in there in a way that the body, or my body, becomes another prop in the setup, so that there's not really a hierarchy among the objects in the image, and really making myself like another sculpture in the image. And there is something about, you know, my hand in that last image we were looking at, More Fragile but More Enduring, which I keep thinking about that title right now, just this idea, because for the obvious reasons, thinking so much about fragility and the fragility of our bodies, and thinking about like what endures. I find myself, I don't know if you've been feeling this at all, but, you know, if I hear a beautiful piece of music or something, and this is where my mind is going, but I just feel this like overwhelming sadness of like, you know, what can be lost.
On that note, because I think, you know, again, thinking about those kind of organ shapes that we were talking about, and these photos almost functioning as a invitation or sort of a look inside the body. And then, you spent a lot of the time in the show kind of creating the sculpture in the back room. So it's the sculpture that you can hold and touch and hug.
When the piece is really active, when someone's interacting with it, there's the viewer's body is the human body in there. So there's something about I don't know, it's like the space of the image is this constructed, imaginary, fictitious, I guess in a way, space. And then there's, a kind of like breaking that barrier and inserting like the living flesh in there. So I think that's happening, that happens when the viewer is interacting with those sculptures. One thing I wanted to say, in the course of all our conversations, I realized something, because you kept asking me, like, and you said people are asking, who's the body in all the images? Like, who is the mother or who is the body? And I realized that, I really think, I'm really thinking about the viewer's body. And it's kind of about, like, your own, like, sense of embodiment as you look at the images. So, that's something I hadn't quite formulated it that way before all these conversations that we've been having.
I thought about that a lot too, especially with the Hold Me sculpture in the back room, where we are a photography gallery and we don't often show sculptures. And so, like, what is the difference between a fabric sculpture and a photograph? And that you've brought the body into the piece in a way that you never touch a photograph. And suddenly there's a sense of touch, beyond just a sense of vision, which is and the sense of touch has been so delightful to people. Like even though I think people sort of read it as abject and a little weird, and it makes them a little bit uneasy maybe at first. It's not uncommon for people to walk in the back room and then just to sort of hear giggling coming out of it.
The images themselves have an incredible tactility. And going back to Navel, for example, with the wrapped frame, there's so much trompe-l'oeil at work in that image and with the way that it's framed, that I think it becomes sort of, it just pulls your hand to it. I mean, part of it is that, the fascination with trompe-l'oeil and like, what is it? Is that real? But it's also just like, it fits into that description that I often use with the work, where it's like a compressed image. So it's, first I photographed cardboard, then printed it on fabric, took that, and that was sewn into this like a facade of a torso with an actual indented navel sewn in there, right? And then re-photographing that. So it's like the photograph on fabric, fabricated into something, re-photographed, then printed on fabric again, and the frame is wrapped with that fabric. So it's just like this very, not quite a distillation, but a real compression of what the image is. And I think that, we did hang the work at different heights in this show, but I think also that tactile aspect of the photographs, and maybe because there are touchable things in the show, it puts you even more in that frame of mind. But with that tactility and with some of the trompe-l'oeil, my idea often is to like try to like have this sensorial experience that is highly visual, but maybe sort of super visual or, beyond that as well.
Yeah, the word I was thinking about was a kind of phenomenological experience, and one that sort of made you aware of your body and aware of your senses in a way that, a photography show doesn't usually ask you to think of your own body.
But sculpture does.
Within the space, what sculpture always does. And I think the other thing that I think about is, I was trying to think of when photos do make you aware of your body.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I realized it's photos of bodies that make you aware of your body.
Huh.
Obviously, like most famously, or the kind of go-to example would be like aspirational advertising, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
photos of skinny, attractive people used to make you want to buy things to make you skinny and attractive too. To like,
Do you want to know where my mind went?
where's that?
Diane Arbus's Jewish Giant.
Yeah, I mean, I think Diane Arbus's, kind of whole oeuvre sort of makes
Yeah.
you. There's that feeling of like, am I so different than these people?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Is my body so much like?
Yeah.
Is my body not sort of weird and freakish as well?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a real physicality to them. You feel I mean, I think, well, in that one in particular, you also feel like the constraints of the architectural space, and I think also like of just the frame, the edge of the image as well.
To sort of take a slight change and something, just if you can describe how you made, I think two really images people have been connecting with a lot were the altar foot and altar hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I used a trope that I like to use where I made a watercolor painting drawing on paper and then cut an oculus or an aperture. So, I painted these concentric circles in kind of hot colors and then cut out an aperture, and throw that right in front of the lens, gets completely blown out and blurry. But it really does such incredibly strange things for foreground and background, which become quite ambiguous or can become quite ambiguous. I'm not sure if that happens in these two quite as much. But for me, they really accentuate this act of looking and this act of perceiving and looking, through the eye, and which is framed by the body and maybe your awareness. But for me, these really heighten awareness of that act of looking.
Well, I think that's so interesting that you think of them that way, because I've had such a different experience with them. And
Do tell.
part of it is because I run a photo gallery. We give a lot of
Mm-hmm.
tours to photo students. And these two pieces, I think, have been some of the most talked about pieces
Huh.
among our groups. And
Huh.
the number one question is, how did you do that?
Oh.
And is that Photoshop, or is that a
Mm.
painted on photograph? Or just the sort of, they're really, I think, visually confounding images.
Mm-hmm, they are.
To a person who is not a photographer. And photographers look at them and they're like, oh, it's a depth of field. You're using depth of field. And I think for photographers, I was thinking they're not about how, to me, I was like, they're not about how the eye sees, they're about how the camera sees. I began to think of these as a kind of nod to the language of photography in a way that it was, I think you have a roster of kind of go-to materials that you've used long before this show, that are prominently featured in this show. Do you want to talk a little bit about your interests and relationships to your kind of beloved humble materials?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is working with really humble, super mundane, readily available materials and a kind of, use what you've got at hand ethos. There's also something like the cardboard, which I've always used for decades. I really like the pedestrian quality of cardboard, but it's also like a really amazing and versatile material. And there's something just really quick about it. So, and that has to do with like this thing of, with this work, this thing of like making a really kind of quick and kind of urgent setup of things, using what's available, what can be manipulated easily and quickly, what can be changed quickly, and then what can be recycled. And then the plaster, it's a material I've used for forever to make sculptures. And again, it's a kind of low, humble material that is easy to manipulate, and can be worked with relative speed. And I think all of that has to do with, I like to work spontaneously. I am not a planner, and I'm really I respond.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about the iterative quality of the work, and in particular, there's the tender interval, the triptych, which is kind of 3 iterations, 3 scenes of the same kind of studio sculptural still life setup, but there's a major there's time that is present in it as well.
Yeah, part of why that is an iterative piece is I worked with that setup for quite a while, and like trying to have everything come together in the right way when you've got the timer going, and then you've got to run over and stick your arm through a hole wearing a manatee paw that you've sewn. You get a lot of iterations. And at a certain point, I think I felt like, this one really was these multiple images, and part of it had to do with like the light at the different times of day, and the kind of, a kind of life to this one. I mean, they all have a lifespan to me. They all, the photograph is always, part of an evolving installation or setup, right? That I think of as a kind of life cycle. And the banana as well, as the way I was thinking about that was a living and decaying.
Well, it's a real, vanitas kind
Yes,
of
exactly. Yes.
moment, right? Where
Yes.
the still life of the rotten
Yes.
fruit, and
Yes. Yes.
of our mortality, and
yeah. And bananas there are lots of jokes about bananas. So,
well, I think that was my next question, and maybe this can be a good question to kind of close on. Talk to me about how you integrate your sense of humor into your work.
I don't know. It's like, you don't want to explain a joke because then it's not funny. It's, I don't know, character flaw. I mean, an impulse to always make a joke. Clearly making jokes is something I like doing in the work, as I like doing in life. But, jokes are also always serious. And there's always this, as you say, like there's always this serious other side to the joke. And like in this one, and in a lot of them, I think mortality is that other side. Yeah, I mean, it's a good vehicle. A joke is a good vehicle.
Yeah, I mean, maybe my kind of theory that my thought that I've been thinking about with humor in your work, and why your sense of humor has always spoken to me so powerfully through the work, is that it is about honesty. And there's something about the jokes which are disarming. Also, I mean, they sort of simultaneously disarm you, and they also kind of put you on edge. And they also kind of make me trust you and feel that there's an honest thing behind it, in a way that, a great comedian can do all 3 of those things, right? It's I think why humor is so important to me, like as it is to you, and
Yes.
why
yes, things can be said.
Things can be said. I mean, you can use humor to chop up a body and put it all over a gallery.
But also, I mean, feelings can be felt too with humor. It's yeah.
again, maybe to bring us back to that big kind of weighty title at the beginning, right? Like,
Yeah.
that humor can be used to, bring us to a infant childlike state.
Also, since you went back to the title, I will say that my mother was irrepressibly funny, and she was quite a joker. So if I have any personal homage in this show, it would be that.
What was her sense of humor like?
Antic.
I love it.
Yeah.